Welcome to episode 131 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 20 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel. Let's get started with my first topic. And this is based on an article that our friend Mike Dano wrote for Light Reading. And the subject matter is the Mexican government thwarting efforts for operator 5G deployments? So it's no secret that AT&T does have a footprint in Mexico. They've acquired spectrum through auctions and that sort of thing, as also through AWS. That spectrum has been low band spectrum, but Mike wrote about the fact that AT&T will be returning that to the Mexican government. And what's going on there is, I've talked about this on prior podcasts, the spiraling cost for licensed spectrum, especially. Again, we can point to C-band, the 80 plus billion, probably 90 billion when it was all said and done. Well, apparently in Mexico, it's even more expensive. And not only do operators have to buy spectrum, but they have to pay an upfront fee. In addition to that, for whatever reason, maybe just to be a participant in the bidding, and an annual usage fee. And so AT&T basically is stating that they're making it very, very difficult for them to deploy the 5G network in that country. There are plans, according to AT&T Mexico, that it would launch its 2.5 gigahertz holdings again, and that's the Goldilocks spectrum that we've talked about in the midband. But that announcement was made in 2021. But still, the deployment across Mexico has been quite slow. AT&T Mexico said that it would cover 25 cities with 5G, and they're not quite there yet. So here's another example of a government, I don't want to call it, greedily lining its pockets, but when you're putting all these additional fees and spectrum auctions balloon out of control, I mean, there's a cost of deploying infrastructure as well, and it's quite costly. It's in the billions of dollars. But I don't know if you caught this news, but would love to get your insight.
I did. I didn't know the details of what the costs were that were making it so prohibitive.
Yeah.
But that does sound like an interesting way for a government to prevent spectrum squatting.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's maybe one of the motivations for it. It's also a good way for revenue for a government to continue to generate revenue after a spectrum auction has occurred.
Yeah.
That way, some of these spectrum agencies don't have to rely on constant auctions of spectrum to continue to fund themselves. So I think it's a good idea, maybe poorly executed. But I also think that, if that spectrum is not being used efficiently, then the economics of those fees don't make sense. In
Yeah.
which case, it might end up in somebody else's hands who might use it more efficiently. So I think this might be more of a positive overall in terms of like making spectrum available to people, but it
Yeah.
also increases the bar or raises the bar for somebody who wants to enter the market.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit like a moat, but at the same time, it's also a good way to keep people from squatting on spectrum, like some people do in the US.
Yeah,
So
that's an interesting perspective. I didn't really think about that annual usage fee. I mean, when you look at the number of years that Dish Wireless in particular sat on spectrum, and then they got to the hairy edge there, risking fines for not meeting coverage goals, and they kind of faked their way out of that. We've talked about that on prior podcasts, but that's an interesting perspective. But from my perspective, also, Mexico is a pretty unique market. You have the ultra wealthy. You don't have, that significant of, sort of a middle class subscriber base, and then you have, the very impoverished. And so, I think it's a good point that you make, but I think the market, just the overall market dynamics in Mexico don't lend well to this, and it just feels like a money grab to me. But we'll continue to monitor this and report back as things develop. We're going to talk about Dish. We're both going to talk about Dish in a second. But first, we're getting really close to earnings season, a quarterly earnings season with all the mobile network operators. And typically Ookla starts publishing their reports, and you want to talk about an Ookla report and T-Mobile.
Yeah, so this report was an Ookla report actually, and they were talking about speed tests in the US. And T-Mobile speeds are now north of 200 megabits per second as a median speed, which is not to be confused with an average.
Right.
And Verizon has a median of 127, and AT&T has a median of 85. So all of them are faster.
Sure.
The difference is that T-Mobile is a lot faster, and the gap between them continues to be quite large. T-Mobile is on the edge of being double Verizon. And is actually faster than Verizon and AT&T combined in terms of their speeds. So there's still quite a gap between the T-Mobile and AT&T and Verizon. But it's clear that AT&T and Verizon are still fairly close, but it kind of seems like Verizon might be pulling away from AT&T now. And I think that might just be because their mid-band deployment started earlier, so they have more of a footprint.
Right.
So I think this is a Q4 thing. So I think we'll probably see AT&T close that gap between itself and Verizon as its network deployment matures, because they've only had 2 quarters to deploy. But Verizon had a whole year at that point. So I think that gap will continue to narrow this year. And I do think Verizon and AT&T will continue to narrow the gap between themselves and T-Mobile. But I don't think it will be close anytime soon, especially with more spectrum becoming available at the end of this year for T-Mobile and AT&T actually. So it'll be really interesting to see how that additional spectrum that will be available later this year will bolster AT&T and T-Mobile, because Verizon doesn't have as much in these later blocks of C-band. So it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, it is. I'm not surprised because we talk about T-Mobile quite a bit on the podcast. We talk about Verizon and AT&T as well. But when you look at the lead that T-Mobile enjoys with respect to having those critical mid-band assets from the get-go with its acquisition of Sprint, and then its first to standalone. You and I have talked about standalone, multiple times. I mean, it'll unlock the true promise of 5G. I think that provides T-Mobile a decided advantage from a performance perspective. But agree with you, AT&T and Verizon should start to close that gap as they continue to deploy their mid-band assets. AT&T has this 110 spectrum auction as well, and we've also talked about that. The profile of that is such that doesn't quite need the same level of densification as C-band, but it's all interesting. So I think we'll see what happens here, but I believe over the next 12 to 18 months we'll start seeing a narrowing of the gap, especially now we're seeing cloud core deployments from AT&T through Azure, and we're seeing similar, but I think it's more limited from Verizon's perspective. They've done some sort of limited 5G core deployment to get closer to that standalone realization, but time will tell. But let's move to my second topic this week, and I sort of alluded to this at the beginning of the podcast. You and I are going to both talk about Verizon, and so my friend Sue Merrick with Fierce Wireless wrote an article this week talking about Dish's prepaid business. Now, I've spoken to this in the past. They've been losing quite a bit from their Boost business from a subscriber standpoint, and initially when the company unveiled its plans, a big part of their plans were to lean into their various acquisitions of MVNOs to build upon a customer base that they could potentially move to a postpaid service. And so they've continued in the latest quarter to lose subscribers. I mean, she had Roger Ederer, who I have a lot of respect for. He's a fellow analyst that spoke to the fact that he didn't believe that that would affect them long term. But my concern is that as they have continued prepaid losses, they're losing revenue, they're losing ARPU, and they're going to need revenue to be able to launch that new postpaid service that you and I have talked about on prior podcasts. So, that could potentially slow things. I mean, they're obviously their coverage mandates and that sort of thing, but what are your thoughts?
I think they're in a tough place.
Yeah.
I think that they probably should have had a more mature network before they made these acquisitions.
Hmm.
I think their strategy is changing, and they're becoming more aggressive on building their own network. But that's kind of in the face of what their original strategy was, which is to kind of do both.
Yeah.
Um, I think that long term they will eventually have their own network, but there's costs to doing that, which we'll talk about in my next topic.
Yeah.
Um, and I just think that uh, they it's not easy being a new entrant into the market, especially when there's a new technology being introduced at the same time. And I just think that um, postpaids are what everybody wants on their balance sheet.
Yeah.
And prepaids are, a great lower margin business. But I just, it's unclear where Dish's financials will land
Hmm.
um, based on their prepaid postpaid mix
Yeah.
and how big both of those businesses will be. So I think we're still very much in the early phases of Dish's deployment and maturity. But I think they are the clock is ticking and they don't have unlimited runway. Um, and I think they've got to, show some real traction fairly soon, or their um, investors and their debt holders are going to be um, asking questions.
Yeah, I mean, you make a really good point. I mean, kind of looking at, what that balance is between prepaid and postpaid. To your point, the prepaid business is a lower margin business. You're not, as an operator, you're not making, you're not earning the same amount of revenue on high end, smartphone sales and that sort of thing. Typically, these prepaid plans, you're purchasing a pretty inexpensive Android phone. It's usually 30 to 50 bucks. Um, and then the other challenge with the prepaid business is just a higher churn rate than postpaid, right? And that factors back into the overall margin. But the biggest concern I have is that whenever Dish officially sort of came out of stealth and announced their plans, they sort of spoke to like how they had acquired these prepaid businesses, and they were boasting, a million subscriber base that they were going to be able to build potentially a postpaid service, on by some sort of conversion. I think their goals may have been a little aggressive and may have been, a little forward looking there, but time will tell. There are other analysts that you and I compete amongst that don't think it's that big of an issue, but time will tell. So we'll see. But you already sort of segued into your own segue. So you want to talk about Dish and you want to talk about some revenue that they're trying to raise.
Yeah. So late last year, Dish talked about raising $2 billion to basically fund their network build out. Um, and now they're talking about raising another $500 million in addition to um, that $2 billion, which they asked for in November of last year. So the bill keeps running up on their network deployment.
Yeah.
To remember, they're using a combination of 2.2 gigahertz AWS for 700 megahertz E block and 1.9 gigahertz H block AWS. So they're using three different slices of spectrum that they already have. And they are doing this through their own virtualized 5G network. So
Yeah.
I think when you look at where they're spending and what they need to do, I think it's mostly equipment, which is obviously why they were pushing Open RAN so hard,
Right.
and why they wanted more competitive solutions. And I do
Mhm.
think that when you look at this $500 million, which I think are convertible notes, so senior secured notes, um, they are looking for ways to make up for, I believe. I believe they're looking for a way to build this network without spending as much money. And I
Sure.
just don't think those options exist yet,
Right.
or necessarily exist in a fashion that would actually drive down prices. So yes,
Mhm.
Open RAN exists. Yes, there's hardware that you can buy and use it for, but I think the economics of Open RAN are not good enough yet, because there's not enough competitors and not enough competition in this space to necessarily um, offer that lower cost deployment that I think Dish needed to make their 5G network a more affordable deployment, within the ballpark of what they're hoping to spend, which I think at the end of this would be $10 billion.
Yes.
So it remains to be seen how much they're going to end up actually spending. But I think they're going to continue to ask for money down the road. But this is just, this could just be part of their plan. But generally, I would hope that they, raise money once a year to do this, rather than every 3 months. So we'll see
Yeah.
how this works out long term. But that's just kind of the update on the Dish Network, and I feel like we kind of front end loaded some of that in our other topic.
No, we did, but I'm going to play devil's advocate because you provided a really nice segue to my third topic, and I want to talk about some 5G predictions that I made Friday of this week. I just posted an article to Forbes, and it was actually I included 3 predictions for 5G and 3 predictions for security. I believe what Dish is probably experiencing is, it's not about there isn't enough competition in Open RAN. I would argue that we may see some consolidation this year. It's no secret that Mavenir has been stumbling. They just had another round of layoffs, and I believe you've got a couple of other incumbents in that space, like in the form of JMA Wireless and Airspan Networks, that are fairly well established. I mean, they're smaller organizations, but they've proven some consistency over time. In fact, Airspan Networks just went through. It was, I'm not exactly sure what the financial terms of it were, but I believe there was some sort of acquisition by a private equity firm, and they've relaunched themselves. They've issued a new ticker symbol called MIMO, pretty clever, and that's obviously that's a way to raise capital and to move their business forward. But I actually don't believe that it's necessarily, Dish is having, kind of some stumbles because of a lack of Open RAN solutions. I think there's going to be a consolidation. I think, the weaker players are going to die, and Mavenir, it looks to me by all measures not to be doing very well, and I think they aggressively overhired prior to the pandemic, and I think they got ahead of themselves there. So I think we'll see some consolidation in Open RAN. Another prediction that I made was just, and this is something that I think you had talked to at the end of the year, and I wanted to go a little bit deeper on it, was network slicing. And so I think this is the year that we're going to see tangible network slicing. It's probably going to be towards the latter part of the year as in the US, for example, as Verizon and AT&T catch up and get to standalone. I think you'll see T-Mobile come out of the gate first. I mean, this is something that enterprises want. I mean, in enterprise services, there are SLAs, guaranteed levels of throughput, availability, latency, and that sort of thing. And enterprises are willing to pay for it for very mission critical applications like manufacturing automation and that sort of thing. So I do believe we're going to start seeing some, not just proof of concepts, but we're going to start seeing some execution against enterprise services. And then, my third prediction, which may not be all that earth shattering, is that I believe fixed wireless access is going to hit its terminal velocity. I mean, there are some people that are saying that it could potentially peak. There are capacity constraints with the number of subscribers you put on, a 5G network. And typically in the home, you consume a lot more data than you do on a smartphone. So, but I also believe that, for example, as T-Mobile continues to build out its standalone and mid-band, that's going to provide them some additional capacity and capability. I also believe that although AT&T has always had a fixed wireless access service, It's really been focused on the enterprise, and they've really led with fiber for home broadband. I do expect that this year, AT&T will get a little more aggressive with respect to its consumer FWA offering. And then I think finally, with Verizon, and you were talking about this earlier, as they continue to build out those mid-band spectrum assets, they're going to be able to improve the quality of that FWA service that they initially launched for, I think, $25, and you get a side of fries with it. And we've been a little critical about the quality of that service, but I think as they build out their C-band, mid-band assets, that performance should improve, and that should allow them to see some decent subscriber growth. And they might even tier it out, at some point, with not necessarily a slice, but maybe with better capacity. I don't know. Time will tell. But that's my third prediction, for the year for 5G. I'll throw it back to you. I know that we did last year, as we ended last year, we did 2 look backs and 1 look forward. Any thoughts there on any additional predictions you might have for 5G?
I definitely agree on the network slicing thing. I think that's going to be a big one.
Yeah.
I feel like we might actually, if we get network slicing early enough this year, I think we'll actually start to see some of the first true 5G applications.
Right.
And I think that's really compelling because we've been using NSA for the last 4 years,
Yeah.
and a G transition is usually a full G is usually about 10 years.
A decade.
So we've spent almost half this G not actually using the
Getting
full
there.
capability of the G.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited about what network slicing will bring. It's not just network slicing. I just think SA in general.
Yeah.
I think network slicing is just a component of that. So for me, I think SA is the big deal, but you can't have SA without, or you can't have network slicing without
Without
SA.
a thing. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and that kind of tees me up for my topic.
Yeah. You want to talk about Ericsson, right?
Yeah, so it's actually not Ericsson. It's about
Okay.
India.
Okay.
And the fact that, India's 5G networks launched late last year. And most of those networks are launching as standalone networks. So, while they are late to the party, they are
They're going straight for
also
the gusto, huh?
exactly. And it's an interesting situation because if you look at how they're deploying, it's SA and they're going with, lots of spectrum, mid, low, high. So these are actually fairly mature networks and they're rolling them out really quickly. They're
Mhm.
hitting 20, 30 cities at a time when they're doing these launches. And as a result, they are now among some of the most mature 5G networks out there. Maybe not
Mhm.
necessarily in terms of coverage quite yet, but in
Yeah.
terms of technological and spectrum capability, they are.
Yeah.
And they might end up leapfrogging a lot of countries that have kind of been dragging their feet. And we could see India being a huge new market for not only 5G devices, but also 5G use cases. We could see some of the earliest 5G use cases actually being deployed in India because the networks are mature, they have the capability,
Yeah.
and they're not worrying about legacy standalone devices or legacy non-standalone devices, which is actually an issue. I follow a lot of people on Twitter, and I follow a lot of people from India, and there was a lot of uproar about how a lot of these new 5G networks are not really compatible with older non-standalone only devices with older modems that do
Right.
have 5G, but it's not standalone 5G. And in India, a lot of people are not able to afford, the latest and greatest phone every year. So they're buying phones every few years. And if you go back maybe 3, 4 years ago, some of those 5G devices were not going to be compatible with standalone networks based on their
Yeah.
modem. So
Right.
it's going to be really interesting to see how that works out. I think there's going to be some pain, but I think overall, I think that is a very short-term pain that I think will in the net be positive for everyone long term.
Yeah.
Because the alternative is what we have here in the US where we still don't have standalone on all 3 carriers.
Yeah.
And as a result, application developers and enterprises aren't able to build applications to all these new 5G use cases because they
Yeah.
can't trust that the network will actually support them everywhere. So
Yeah.
India is a really interesting use case.
Yeah.
What Ericsson's CEO said was that India's 5G networks are basically ahead of the rest of the world,
Wow.
and may even leapfrog China with just the speed that these things are being rolled out.
Hmm.
And India in 4G was late as well, but it became a huge growth center for a lot of companies. And I think we might see that happen this year with 5G and standalone. So watch out for India.
Yeah.
See what's going on there. There's going to be some really interesting stuff coming out of there, I believe. And I think we're going to start seeing real 5G use cases, maybe end of this year, maybe early next year.
Yeah. What's interesting, as you kind of walk through that for our audience of viewers and listeners, it got me thinking, you know, there, from the US perspective, there's a huge initiative to pull a lot of manufacturing that was offshore to bring it back onshore, right? But also, India is a very friendly country to the United States, and that's an area for potential offshore. If companies want to move offshore manufacturing from China to a more friendly place in the world, and I'm wondering if the incentive for India is they want to capture some of that reshoring activity for manufacturing. It might be a stretch,
I
but
actually think that you are right,
yeah,
that there is some desire to shift manufacturing out of China, either towards Vietnam or India.
yeah,
So I think you're absolutely correct there. I think India's biggest challenge is its bureaucracy.
yeah.
Um, India is literally the largest bureaucracy in the world now. They're also the largest democracy in the world.
Yeah,
Um, but the challenges there, I think, might impede some of that offshoring.
yeah,
Um, and I mean, they pushed a lot of that offshoring to begin with when they started making a lot really high tariffs for imports. So they made it so that people would start manufacturing in India.
yeah,
I think manufacturing in India will continue to grow, but I think having these 5G networks and standalone might even help them even more. To
yes,
say, we have
yeah,
the internet infrastructure in place to make this happen.
yeah,
So I think you have a valid point there. I think it might be a, a little on the optimistic side, but I do think there is some validity to it. But yeah, I think the U.S. also needs to move more quickly to upgrade our networks to enable smart manufacturing
yeah,
and smart facilities, because there are going to be fewer people running these factories. I've seen some factories where, even outside the US, where, a factory used to employ one line, employed dozens of people, and now it takes less than a dozen to run the
right,
same line.
right.
So automation is not going away.
No,
And we just have to plan for it better. And
yeah,
I do believe that 5G will be a big pivot for that, regardless of where you are. I think China also needs to implement the same thing. They lost, what was it, like 800,000 people in terms
yeah.
of their population growth
It's been
last year.
brutal. Yeah, with COVID. Yeah, they finally announced the numbers. I read that a few
So
weeks
it's,
ago.
you know, population growth is not happening everywhere evenly. And as a result, the automation and smart manufacturing is going to be something that needs to happen. So, yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how India plays its part in this, new world.
Yeah, I'll just finish with I've spoken about this before. I mean, the opportunity for private cellular within manufacturing is huge. I think half the addressable market for private networking, LTE and 5G, is within manufacturing and for manufacturing automation. It's not just about eliminating jobs, it's about being able to change lines over more quickly, to be more nimble, to improve efficiency, to reduce scrap, improve profitability, a whole host of things, because traditionally manufacturing environments have been sort of a mishmash of different connectivity modalities. But with that said, it's been another great podcast, my friend. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide insights on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Willtown Tech, and I'm at Anshel. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune in again next week.